human rights to be achieved, all parties must be engaged, aware, and understand the links between a healthy environment and human rights fulfillment. Without a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, enjoying other rights such as life, food, health, water, and development becomes a challenge. Knowledge and awareness on the link between the environment and human rights remains low, with limited processes and tools to share any knowledge that is available. To overcome this, all parties, government, private, and the community, must be involved in awareness raising and knowledge sharing activities. Innovative research, as well as communicating and implementing research findings, is also a priority. Finally, tools and trainings must be developed and used to ensure there is awareness of the link between human rights and the environment across all parts of society. An increased understanding of this intrinsic link can result in a better natural environment and stronger human rights for those who live within it. Gender equality and the human rights-based approach in disaster risk reduction is central to address and reduce the impacts of climate change. Yet current frameworks provide limited guidance on how these aspects should be utilized in practice. The framework for integrating human rights and gender equality, or FIRE, bridges this gap, compiling international standards and guidelines for disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and emergency preparedness under 6 primary dimensions. Developing and improving governance systems and structures, including disaster risk reduction laws and policies, inclusive institutions, and diverse platforms for civil society engagement. Ensuring fundamental rights and equality are reflected within international standards and processes as a foundation for the overall advancement of equality and inclusiveness. Addressing discrimination and inequality based on identity and socioeconomic characteristics, which widely intersect and affect the enjoyment of rights. Promoting participation of all people in decision-making that affects them, alongside inclusive access to information. Empowering rights holders, particularly disadvantaged and marginalized groups, to exercise their rights and to influence decisions that shape such rights. Examining, understanding, and then transforming social and gender norms that cause inequalities and contribute to contexts of vulnerability. FIRE is now being utilized to promote and protect human rights, with particular focus to gender and inclusivity within the implementation of disaster risk reduction mechanisms at global, regional, and local levels. For human rights to be achieved, all parties must be engaged, aware, and understand the links between a healthy environment and human rights fulfillment. Without a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, enjoying other rights such as life, food, health, water, and development becomes a challenge. Knowledge and awareness on the link between the environment and human rights remains low, with limited processes and tools to share any knowledge that is available. To overcome this, all parties, government, private, and the community, must be involved in awareness raising and knowledge sharing activities. Innovative research, as well as communicating and implementing research findings, is also a priority. Finally, tools and trainings must be developed and used to ensure there is awareness of the link between human rights and the environment across all parts of society. An increased understanding of this intrinsic link can result in a better natural environment and stronger human rights for those who live within it. Gender equality and the human rights-based approach in disaster risk reduction is central to address and reduce the impacts of climate change. Yet current frameworks provide limited guidance on how these aspects should be utilized in practice. The framework for integrating human rights and gender equality, or FIRE, bridges this gap, compiling international standards and guidelines for disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and emergency preparedness under 6 primary dimensions. Developing and improving governance systems and structures, including disaster risk reduction laws and policies, inclusive institutions, and diverse platforms for civil society engagement. Ensuring fundamental rights and equality are reflected within international standards and processes as a foundation for the overall advancement of equality and inclusiveness. Addressing discrimination and inequality based on identity and socioeconomic characteristics, which widely intersect and affect the enjoyment of rights. Promoting participation of all people in decision-making that affects them, alongside inclusive access to information. Empowering rights holders, particularly disadvantaged and marginalized groups, to exercise their rights and to influence decisions that shape such rights. Examining, understanding, and then transforming social and gender norms that cause inequalities and contribute to contexts of vulnerability. FIRE is now being utilized to promote and protect human rights, with particular focus to gender and inclusivity within the implementation of disaster risk reduction mechanisms at global, regional, and local levels.
Selamat pagi. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the launch of the Human Rights in the Process of National Adaptation Planning Report, co-organized by Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law and the Stockholm Environment Institute. My name is Windy Arini. I'm a program officer at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute in Jakarta. We are working on a regional basis covering Asia and the Pacific. And we focus on human rights and environment, working with multi-stakeholders on different levels. And this is our newest product, and you have it on your hand, but you also can find it in our website, which is rwi.or.id. And to formally welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, both in person in Jakarta and online from across Indonesia and the region. I would like to call Dr. Jason Squire, who is our director of the Regional Asia Pacific Office. Please, Jason, you have 5 minutes.
Thanks, Windy. Welcome. Isn't it good to be in the room together, as opposed from Zoom? But of course, I know we're being joined by others online. So I'd like to thank you all for making the effort to come this morning and also to connect with us. We're really pleased with this piece of work. It's a great example of a collaboration between ourselves, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, and the Stockholm Environment Institute, so SEI. We've been working together for a number of years, working on pieces of research and documents and collaborating in the areas of getting awareness and good solid research on climate change and resilience and adaptation and the conversation around climate change, which is very much part of what we need to do now. We need to be speaking about tools and pieces of work that specifically speak to groups who have responsibilities within government and within civil society. So I need to first do some acknowledgements. I've got them written. Of course, we and the Raoul Wallenberg Institute in Indonesia are partners with the Ministry of Law and Human Rights and the Director General of Human Rights. And we are very pleased that I think the representatives, not as yet, okay. And also, of course, we've got Dr. Wong Sok, who's the ASEAN Secretariat Environmental Division. We're so pleased that you could join us today. We've got a good panelists group that we're putting together. So I want to thank you for sitting on that today for us. And of course, I want to again thank SEI and the team there. We work really well together, and I'm pleased that we're able to bring things together. So when we look at this document, I think this is a really good example of indicating that human rights, the complexity, sometimes people can be quite intimidated when you say human rights and climate change. You think, well, hang on, how is this connected? What is the UN Declaration on Human Rights got to do with climate change? Well, this document actually gives you a pretty good example of the links. The fundamental rights of participation, inclusion, redress, and making sure that people are at the centre of any response, because it's just not going to be government responsibility, ultimately. It has to be all of us aware of what our role is and what our rights are to be able to be part of that process. So we're very keen, excuse me, we're very keen to put documents into the space, into the public sphere, that connect the human rights and climate change adaptation or resilience. We have many documents, and I encourage you to visit our website, get onto our socials, because we've got a lot of documents that specifically speak around the right to a healthy environment, gender, women's inclusion and empowerment in environment. We've got a policy briefs series, which speaks to judicial actors, to business community. We've got a human rights city, sorry, Wendy, of course, Wendy, this is her area, human rights cities document, handbook about localizing human rights and SDGs at the local level. And it's specifically aimed at local governments, people who would carry the majority of the load when they're talking with citizens, and making sure that inclusion and participation sit at the heart of anything that governments do and that we do as civil society actors. We need to be as aware and make sure that we are including and participating, in transparent, egalitarian processes. It's not just about other people. So this is incumbent on us as well. And it's great that we've produced something. It's a starting point for conversations. This is internationally, when you read it, if you do read it, I hope you do, that it's got an international context. It's not just about this part of the world. Everyone's facing the same issues. Everyone has to look into other examples to try and find their way. And we've hopefully contributed something here which will give them a starting point. We are intending, I hope, to translate these into languages, regional languages. And we've been doing that a lot in the last couple of years. And if you go onto our website, there'll be a lot of our documents are available in all regional languages as much as we can. And of course, we're the Asia Pacific office, so we make sure that we focus on Asia Pacific languages. And I want to thank the RWI team. Putting this together is a lot of energy. If any of you have been involved in putting together a document like this, it is not a short process. It takes time, particularly when you're analysing other countries' national adaptation plans, when you're putting your name on a document which has got global reach. We like to, and we ensure we have the rigour to make sure it's well researched, it's cross-checked. We have reviewers that look at it. We try as best as possible to put out something which you can rely on when you use it. Okay, so that's really important to us. And we are really pleased that we've been able to launch this. So thank you to the RWI team. And I also would like to say that not next week, the week after, we're doing a similar launch, a parallel launch, I suppose we'll call it, in Bangkok. So we're launching it in Jakarta because that's where our regional office is. And we, of course, want to make sure that this lands well here and also in Bangkok at the regional levels. And we've got a lot of the regional embassies and representatives there. I should also, it would be remiss of me not to say thank you to the Swedish government because they were the ones that funded this. And we're a proud partner of the Swedish government, CEDA. So thank you, enjoy, and I'll hand over to the conveners.
Thank you, Jason. So to warm it up a bit, we want to launch a Slido, very short Slido survey. So both our online participants and in person, please just type sli.do Slido on your computer or phone, on your browsers. And if our IT technician can help us to view the Slido, please. And I have to acknowledge that we have 46 participants online, so that's a good number. So okay, so okay. Okay, so for our in-person participants, you can join slido.com and punch in the code hashtag 2394636. So the code is hashtag 2394636. So if you have opened your Slido, the first question is which country you're from. So far we got a lot of Indonesians. Again, another code is 2394636, slido.com. We have good representative from the Philippines as well, and also Myanmar and Thailand. So good to have so many diverse participants online and offline here as well. So if everyone has done the first question, maybe we could go to the second one. So the question is, before coming to this event, have you heard of national adaptation plans? Oh, we got a lot of yeses. Okay, we have 61% of yeses and 39% of nos, but so this is also why we have this launch. Victor in the next session will give you a bit of a brief about human rights and climate change, and then Albert later on will explain more about the report itself, where you can also learn a little bit more about what is a national adaptation. So next, the last question, please. So if you knew about national adaptation plans, have you been involved in planning one or contribute to one? Whether in your city or your country, in whatever capacity that you are having right now. Okay, we have few yeses. That's good. Okay, so I think most of us have completed. We got a big number of no's, but stopping you from contributing to maybe not national adaptation plans, but other adaptation programs or activities that your country or your cities are planning and implementing. And hopefully you do insert or integrate human rights principles into your contribution or the planning of your national climate adaptation plans. So I think that's it for our first Slido. We will have another one right after the discussion later on. And for the next session, we will have a setting the scene by my colleague, Victor Bernard. So Victor is the program officer for the Raoul Wallenberg Institute based in Bangkok, where he manages RWS regional activities and programs on human rights and the environment, focusing on regional and national stakeholders. Victor joined us since 2018, and he has been spearheading a number of research initiatives, as well as trainings and other international conferences that RWI has been participating, including the COP26 last year, and hopefully we can again join the COP27 later in November this year. So Victor, without further ado, you have 10 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Wendy, for this for your kind introduction. And I'm so pleased that so many of you are here in person as well as online. Just to begin, we are repeatedly hearing how climate change is the defining issue of our time, and how funding for climate change adaptation action is urgently needed to help the most vulnerable countries deal with the escalating climate shocks. Research has warned that 85% of the world's population, most of who reside in developing and least developed countries, has experienced extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change. The majority of them are here in the Asia-Pacific region, which is home to approximately 4.3 billion people and is among the most vulnerable regions to impacts of climate change. Many Asia-Pacific communities are already experiencing more frequent occurrences of extreme weather conditions, rising sea levels, flooding, and other such climate-induced disasters. Heavily populated and low-lying areas have become increasingly exposed to hazards leading to rising displacement and migration, as well as greater risk for the remaining communities. Climate change adaptation is therefore no longer a choice, but an urgent priority to save lives and protect human rights. Adaptation must become part and parcel of countries' and communities' response to climate change measures. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has warned in its latest report that the adverse effects of climate change are hitting us faster than anticipated, and confirmed that some of the changes in our climate have become irreversible. In other words, climate change is no longer a theoretical and distant phenomenon, but an imminent crisis that is happening even more quickly than we have feared. Without urgent action, the climate crisis will become one of the greatest human rights challenges of our time, exacerbating inequalities and threatening lives and livelihoods. The UN Human Rights Council has recognized that the impacts of climate change will adversely affect the enjoyment of our human rights, both directly and indirectly, including the rights to life, health, water, food, housing, and adequate standard of living, and more. Marginalized and disadvantaged groups, including women, children, persons with disabilities, and ethnic minorities, and so forth, are among those who will be disproportionately exposed to the immediate climate risks and shocks, as well as the socioeconomic ramifications that will further exacerbate their vulnerabilities and marginalization. The Paris Agreement further recognized the link between human rights and climate change in its preamble, which was adopted to advance international cooperation to combat climate change and set the world on the path to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Such a link has been re-emphasized by the UN Human Rights Council, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and various treaty bodies. More recently, as you may know, the Human Rights Council recognized for the first time the human right to a safe, healthy, and sustainable environment, a right which is at risk of being seriously undermined by climate change. Besides the direct human rights impacts of climate change itself, measures designed to mitigate and adapt to climate change can also negatively affect human rights. Therefore, it is essential to implement human rights-based and gender equality approaches to ensure that actions designed to mitigate and respond to climate change, as well as remedy its consequences, also understand and address structural conditions and power dynamics that make certain groups more vulnerable and exposed to climate change. RWI, as Jason noted, has in partnership with a wide range of actors, including the Stockholm Environment Institute, worked on human rights and climate change in various ways. RWI has undertaken research that ranges from the 10-country thematic study on displacement in the context of disaster and climate change across the Asia Pacific, the thematic study on the right to a healthy environment in Southeast Asia, and a report outlining the framework for integrating human rights and equality in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. RWI has also launched its research initiative on human rights and climate change adaptation at COP26 in Glasgow of the UNFCCC. This was followed by the research paper on human rights and the processes of national adaptation planning, which you can see today or read today in the report, that assessed the extent to which published national adaptation plans incorporate human rights and gender equality in accordance with international human rights law and standards. At the same time, a number of reports have underscored the systemic disregard of the needs and rights of various marginalized groups in both nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans, including the recently published report titled Disability Inclusion in National Climate Commitments and Policies. This report showcases how persons with disabilities were among the most vulnerable to climate impacts, yet many of them have been systematically ignored in adaptation plans. Only 45 countries out of the 192 parties to the Paris Agreement refer to persons of disabilities, but only in a cursory manner, without including meaningful mechanisms to consult people with disabilities, for instance. This trend is also captured in our study that Albert will present today, a trend which stems from a limited understanding of the connections between rights and needs of various marginalized groups and the climate crisis. and how rights-based and gender equality approaches can ensure that the response to climate action will be more equitable and fairer, leaving no one behind. I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and I hope this event will further enlighten you on the subject matter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victor, for a very short and sweet setting the scene for us and our discussion today. So next we have our partner, Albert Salamanca, who is beaming in from Bangkok. Hi, Albert. Hope you can hear and see us.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes. So Albert is a senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute's Asia Center, where he leads its climate change, disasters, and development cluster. Albert has over 15 years of experience working on climate change adaptation, natural resources management, conservation, development, and sustainable livelihood issues in several countries in Southeast Asia. So Albert, you will have 20 minutes. And for our participants online, if you do have a question for Victor or Albert, please do type in your questions in the Q&A box. Or our in-person participants, we will have a very short time later on, but you can post your question after Albert's presentation. So if our IT technician can help us with the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
We will see Albert's PowerPoint real soon.
Thanks a lot, Wendy. And thanks also to RWI for organizing this event. And we've been, as Jason mentioned, we've worked with RWI for quite a while now, and it's been really a productive partnership. And we're really glad to have this opportunity to share with you the outcome of the study that we have conducted during the last few years. In fact, this study was made at the height of COVID. So this is one of the products. I guess it's good that we have COVID because we're able to focus on doing some things productively. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the study that's being mentioned, and I think there are hard copies available to you. If you want to get the online copy, this is the site where you can download it. So you can download it at the RWI website. Next slide, please. So the study is being co-authored by both SCI and RWI. So this particular slide will show you that a lot of the emissions are actually being contributed by the global north. But I think maybe this is not something new to you, but maybe graphically, this shows that at least 52% of global emissions since 1990. So between 1990 and 2015 were from rich countries. And if you look at the green on the other side, on the farthest end, only 7% of global emissions that's causing climate change is being contributed by the global south. So in other words, the poor countries in the world, yet we suffer more from the impacts. So this is where issues of human rights would really come in, because our contribution to the factors that lead to climate change, it's really quite minimal. It's not, we're not saying it's non-existent, but we're saying that it's really quite small compared to the emissions by the global north, by the rich countries in the global north. Yet we are facing the impacts. So we're facing the effects of climate change. Next slide, please. So just to demonstrate, in 2013, a super typhoon happened in the Philippines as a result, and this has been demonstrated to be a cause of climate change. So this is what I'm saying, that we're now beginning to feel the impacts of climate change happening. Next slide, please. So the last two slides actually show that climate change is in fact fundamentally a human rights issue. And Victor has already eloquently illustrated this, why climate action needs to be based on human rights principles. Next slide. So maybe I'm not sure whether it's showing properly on your screen, but on my screen it's a bit unclear. I think can you? Yeah, it's being cut, so maybe they're not able to see the actual slides, the actual text. I wonder if you can fix it. So what this slide in fact is showing is that this is just explaining to you the NAP process. So the NAP process is a strategic process that enables countries to identify and address their medium and long-term priorities for adapting to climate change. So the NAP is articulated already in the Paris Agreement. So especially for least developed countries, they are required to come up with national adaptation plan. And all these plans also are basis for funding in global funding bodies, like for example, the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund. Next slide, please. I'm not sure whether it's being resolved. Yeah, so this particular slide, there seems to be a problem with the slides. But anyway, this particular slide shows you what the Paris Agreement is talking about. So it tells us that, so when it came into effect in 2016, so if you remember, it was negotiated in 2015, and when it came into effect, it tells us that adaptation action should follow a country-driven, gender-responsive, participatory, and fully transparent approach, taking into consideration vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems, and should be based on and guided by the best available science and, as appropriate, traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems. I think in the context of Indonesia, this is really quite important because there's a lot of traditional knowledge in Indonesia. So next slide, please. Next slide. Is it moving at your end? Okay, so here are the objectives of the NAPs. So again, let me just highlight that for least developed countries, they are required to come up with NAPs. That's why there's also a lot of support being provided to least developed countries to come up with the NAPs. Whereas for non-least developed countries, so for example, the developing countries, they're not really required, they're only invited. So that's why their NAPs, so for example, the NAP of Indonesia is not really required to be submitted to the UNFCCC. So you won't find it in the UNFCCC portal, whereas the NAPs of the least developed countries are deposited there. The reason for that is that because when it comes to adaptation, the least developed countries have the least capability, right? And they're also the most affected by the impacts of climate change. So a lot of support is being generated to help them. So, so there are two objectives of the NAP process. So to reduce vulnerability to the impacts of climate change by building an adaptive capacity and resilience of countries, and then to facilitate the integration of climate change adaptation in a coherent manner into relevant new and existing policies, programs, activities, in particular development planning processes and strategies within all relevant sectors and at different levels as appropriate. So the whole intention for the NAPs is that to enable, to help countries come up with a coherent plan on how to address climate change adaptation and how to include this into other plans and programs. Next slide, please. So this slide will show you, this is just an example. So if you look at the RAN-API, so I think RAN-API is Rancana Action National Adaptasi Perubahan Iklim, right? This is for, so this is the Indonesian adaptation plan. So the Indonesian adaptation plan was formulated or published in 2019. So they have articulated there. So if you look at that particular document, that the case for why adaptation planning. So for example, here it says that if we have adaptation plans, Indonesia is able to reduce potential economic losses at 50.51% by 2024. And it has also costed all other benefits from adaptation. So for example, if we adapt properly from the impacts of climate change, Indonesia will avoid 350,828 cases of dengue fever by 2024. And then Indonesia would have protected at least 269.2 trillion square meter of water resource. And then when it comes to rice production, for example, 8,406.4 million tons of rice will be maintained if adaptation is done on time. So the flip side on this one is that if adaptation is not done at all, then we would have the corresponding losses for a country such as Indonesia. So Indonesia published the summary of its national adaptation plan, but actually, I think Indonesia has gone through two series of adaptation planning already. So it's worth looking at that. Next slide, please. So we conducted this study because we wanted to find out, we knew that a lot of countries already are beginning to undertake their national adaptation plans. In fact, by November of last year, there were more than 100 countries already in various stages of their adaptation planning. But of course, not all of them were deposited in the UNFCCC website. Of those national adaptation plans, I think about 6 of them are now fully undergoing implementation. So the objectives of the study that we have conducted with RWI, the first one is to assess how human rights are being integrated into the NAP process, and then to map how they have been directly or indirectly referenced in existing NAPs. Because we really wanted to find out to what extent the NAPs are responding to the needs of the vulnerable and at-risk communities, because that's the focus of adaptation, right? The reason also for this is that because it tends to be, when you have a whole society approach, you tend to look at the majority. That's why we tend to forget the needs of the minorities. So for example, it tends to be that a lot of the national adaptation plans actually tends to look at the needs of people who are sort of able-bodied, and tends to belong to the majority cultures. And what that means is that if you don't really deploy a human rights lens, you will forget the needs of other groups, other minority groups, the groups, for example, the elderly, children, youth, people with disabilities, and even ethnic communities. We will tend to forget them unless we deploy a human rights approach, because we have to ensure that fundamentally the rights of everyone will be protected. So these are just to show the methods that we have used. So we look at the human rights principles, especially articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then we do a keyword search in each of the NAPs, and then we do the analysis. Next slides. So in the next slide, it will show you where the NAPs. So the thing also is that, so if you go to the UNFCCC portal, you will see which countries are depositing their NAPs. So we've started by doing that. And then since our ability also to analyze non-English NAPs were limited, so we focus only on the English NAP. So that's why we analyzed only 15 documents. So for example, here, just to show, this is the on the right-hand side on your screen, you will see the cover pages of the Fiji NAP and also the Timor-Leste NAP. Next slide, please. So what are the key findings? So maybe this is really quite obvious to you, but this is just highlights the point, an important point, in fact, that few countries directly mention human rights at all, let alone in a way that guides any part of the NAP process. So if the NAP is supposedly meant to address the needs of the vulnerable and at-risk communities, a lot of them are not really informed by principles of human rights. There were indirect references to human rights, but they vary. And then there were references to like rights to food, water, health in the NAPs. So human rights principles and obligations are not generally utilized in a way that guide the NAP process. I think this is a key challenge. How do we enable this? But I think this is also not unique to the NAPs, right? Human rights per se, especially in the region, is facing a very strong headwind in terms of its implementation. In fact, a number of countries in the region has sort of retreated in terms of their commitments to human rights. Next slide, please. So this slide, I'm not sure whether you can read it. I'm not sure. Can we try to play it full screen, please, so that everyone can see exactly the text written on the text, because it's quite small at my end. But anyway, these are some of the rights being referenced in the NAP. So for example, gender equality or women rights, you will find them referred to in the Timor-Leste, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, Fiji, Kenya, and Kiribati NAPs. And then access to resources and land rights. So again, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, and then you will find them also in Fiji, Sudan, Suriname. And the right to a healthy environment, you will find that to Sudan, Fiji, Kiribati, and then indigenous rights also in Brazil, Suriname, Sudan. And then there's also a reference to the right to healthcare, the right to water, civil and social rights, child rights, education, food and nutrition, housing, infrastructure, and intellectual property. But among the NAPs that we have reviewed, one of the sort of outstanding in terms of a very strong focus on human rights is the Fiji NAP. So if you would really want to look at what a NAP document would look like when seen from a human rights perspective or approach using a human rights-based approach, I think Fiji is a good example. That's why if you look at in the number of human rights principles, it's always Fiji that's being mentioned. So it's worth looking at that. So the key challenge now for Fiji is to actually evaluate what comes out. So the outcome. So after a period of implementation, it's good to look at what happened to the implementation of the Fiji NAP, because it's supposedly being approached through the use of human rights principles. Next slides, please. So what are some of the next steps? So in the document, we've offered some openings or some entry points on how we can bring in human rights discussions or human rights principles in the planning of NAPs. And this is also one of the intention of RWI to develop guidelines or even courses or capacity building activities to highlight how the human rights principles can actually inform and ensure that the NAP process will respond to the needs of the vulnerable and at-risk communities. And we also would like to listen from you to know about what you think would be some of those approaches to bring in human rights principles in the NAP process. And then we would like to engage more with NAP planners and implementers like yourselves to develop capacities on how the human rights principles or obligations can guide actions in responding to the needs of the marginalized and vulnerable groups and implementing our planning the NAP. And then of course, we need to track the progress of the implementation of the NAP process. we have to remember also that because the NAP becomes a global document, and there's a lot of also interests from other global stakeholders to look at the outcomes. So if you look at in the context of the Paris Agreement, there's going to be a global stack take next year to look at how countries are implementing their commitments to the Paris Agreement, and the NAP process is one of those. Next slide, please. So this is just to show to you what are the steps. So the processes and steps within the NAP. So all countries are following this process. So there's a step on laying the groundwork. So here in this particular slide, you will see that there are 4 elements, and in each of the elements there are steps. So you can actually look at where your country is with regards to a particular step, because all countries, especially if you're a least developed country, you are required to develop a NAP so that other stakeholders can actually know how to support you. So there's an element on laying the groundwork and addressing the gaps, and then there are also preparatory elements. And then there's an implementation strategy element, and then reporting, monitoring, and review, and it becomes a cyclical process to ensure that the needs of those who will be affected by the impacts of climate change will be addressed so that they're able to anticipate the impacts, absorb the impacts, and or adapt to the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. So graphically, this is how the various elements are tied together, or they flow together. So the first 2 elements, laying the groundwork and the preparatory work, are within the planning process. So in the NAP process, you've got the planning, the implementation, and then the monitoring and evaluation. And within that are 4 enabling factors. So you've got financing, institutional arrangement, information sharing, and then capacity development. Here we argue that you can actually make each of the process informed by human rights principles. So you can think in terms of non-discrimination. So who are groups who are excluded in each of the processes? How did they participate? Did they participate meaningfully? Do they have access to information? How are the accountability mechanisms set up? Are the rights holders accountable to these groups? And then how are they being sustained? So all of these principles actually, we argue, can be incorporated in the different aspects of the NAP process. So this is where a lot of the stakeholders ourselves would be really useful to ensure that the different aspects of the NAP process are implemented in a way that fulfills, promotes human rights-based principles. Because without us also following at that process, the rights holders might actually forget also on their obligations to ensure that those human rights principles are fulfilled. So again, we believe that each of the processes in the NAP process can be approached from a human rights-based way through the following principles. Next slide, please. So this will be my last slide. So an important, I think, idea here is that in the context of the NAP process, we really have to recognize who these vulnerable and at-risk communities are. And we really have to develop action plans to address their needs, because if we don't recognize them, I don't think we would be able to address also their concerns. So that's really fundamental. And if no one is advocating for the needs in the NAP process, then we might just forget them. And when impacts occur, then they are likely to suffer to them. So I think fundamental to all of this discussion is that we have to recognize who these vulnerable and at-risk communities are. Thank you very much, and happy to discuss further. Thank you.
Yeah, Thank you so much, Albert, and I'm sincere apologies for the technical difficulties. But before we have a break, I have one question from our online participants. So maybe Albert and Victor can respond to this. So I'm going to read it out. So this is from Fitria, representing Youth Right Ambassador for Clean, Healthy, and Sustainable Environment by ASEAN Youth Forum, which are here with us today as well in person. And her questions are twofold. One is the NAP analysis only for the least developed countries? Would there be different measures to analyze NAP from least developed countries and NAP from countries which are not obligated to apply NAP? And the second question is, how do you see business and human rights, including a right to safe, clean, healthy environment from workers' indicators, captured in the NAP itself, and how important is it to be incorporated? So Victor or...
Yeah, maybe I can answer the first question and then Victor can answer the second one. Thanks a lot, Faria, for this interesting question. And I'm glad that you're really interested in the NAP process. So in answer to the question one, is the NAP analysis only for the least developed countries? No, all countries, if they're able to respond properly to the impacts of climate change, so that they're able to properly ensure adaptation, they really have to have a coherent national adaptation plan. Although they're not being required, and least support is being provided for non-least developed countries, it's an important. So for example, if those countries would like to access funding from the Adaptation Fund or for the Green Climate Fund, the NAP is an important document to show that that particular need for funding is actually being articulated in the National Adaptation Plan. The reason why a lot of support is given to the least developed countries is that because they have the least resources to enable planning. So they're being prioritized because, again, the focus of the NAP is to look at vulnerable and at-risk communities. And these communities tend to be also located in least developed countries. So that's why a lot of support needs to be provided. In fact, there's an expert group, a least developed countries expert group, just solely looking at the needs of the least developed countries. So this is also because there's a strong recognition that least developed countries need the resources, need the technical expertise, need insights. So it needs a lot of hand-holding when it comes to the NAP. But like, for example, I've just highlighted earlier, Indonesia. Indonesia has prepared NAPs. I believe 2 cycles of NAP planning being undertaken in Indonesia. In fact, what we can do now is to review the outcomes of the NAP process in Indonesia and see what are the impacts. So, Victor?
Hello? Oh, the question disappeared. Yes, thank you so much, Fitria, for your question on business and human rights. Well, my view is exactly what the finding was in the report, that whilst human rights was mentioned generally and broadly, it wasn't done in a systematic way, mainly in a cursory manner, and it wasn't really linked to business directly. But and also there was a sub-question, or in that question, on the right to healthy environment. That particular right was not referenced at all, to our disappointment. But there was also another question, how important it is to incorporate such a right. And I do think that it is imperative, because having the right to a healthy environment ensures that there is a standard, a common standard of what a healthy environment should be and why it is a right. So there are some procedural and substantive rights, or substantive elements to that right, such as food, water, health, air, and the procedural would be public participation, information, access to justice. Once you incorporate that, the right to a healthy environment, into the NAP, you are recognizing that all of these elements are equally applicable to each national adaptation plan. So that's why I would say it's imperative to have that. And how do I see business and human rights in this? Well, business and human rights, well, the the guiding principles in business and human rights codifies existing rights and applies it to businesses and governments as well in a business context. So essentially the rights that are in there exist in other treaties before it. So whilst it is equally important to recognize human rights in business context, having a broader human rights framework should be prioritized.
We still have 5 minutes before break, so I can take one more question from online participants, unless our offline participants have a question. I could take one question. Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation, Victor. So this is very interesting because when we talk about the adaptation in my mind is very complex, comprehensive, many aspects. We talk about the cross sectors, multidisciplines, multidimensions, and of course, talking about the national and regional as well. So this is the real challenge for Indonesia. And Indonesia, actually, we have twice experiences related to the NAPS. First 2013, and then 2019. It's better in terms of scientific base. But of course, when we talk about the human right, this is the challenges for us. Why? Because mostly 70% budget dedicated for scientific base, and 13 and the remains for public consultation and so on, FGD. So where is the position of vulnerable groups? Elder people, disabilities people, and other vulnerable people, children and women. So this is the critical. It's not easy. It's not easy because this is related to the budget. And of course, the commitment in the period of the process of NAP itself. So this is, yes, this is what we have. But of course, I do believe that in the futures, we have to take the vulnerable groups, sit together and getting their perspective. Because when we talk about the adaptation, this is about the local characteristic, local challenge, not national. National talking about the climate scenarios, and then of course the impact directly on the local impact. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your intervention there. And I noticed that you mentioned persons with disabilities. And you're right in saying that public consultation has been featured quite broadly in most national adaptation plans, but it hasn't really resulted in anything meaningful in the sense that countries haven't facilitated meaningful public participation. And you can see that, for example, with persons with disabilities, because there are a number of projects now that are funded that stems from a national adaptation plan on adaptation, such as early warning systems, that haven't been geared or targeted to those people with, for example, visual or hearing impairments. And this has been a criticism in the report that I just mentioned, that human rights is just done cursory on top, and it's only done in a generic way. And also public participation, you mentioned 30%, which also is an interesting figure. But has that public participation actually led to anything meaningful? Because you can have a forum, but if you're not listening or if you're not including anyone, then of course there's going to be problem down the line. And this report, as mentioned, highlights that with persons with disabilities. I don't know if Albert wants to complement this answer.
Yeah, I want to add something also. I think it's also fundamentally with the problem with the whole human rights system, right? Because it's really being seen as just international commitments. I think we still fail to really see human rights as principles to guide our interaction with each other, to guide the way we respond to the needs of different groups. Because if you come to think of it, it's really encouraging us to consider that everyone has fundamental rights. So if everyone has fundamental rights, that means they're entitled to whatever development plans or outcomes is there available in the country. So in other words, they would have a stake in any development in the country. If that is the starting principle, then we should ensure that when it comes to responding to the impacts of climate change, that their needs are catered to. So again, I think it's really going back, how do we ensure that our actions are really based on human rights principles? Because it's clear when climate change happen, when the impacts occur, it will affect people differently depending on your circumstances. So in other words, if you happen to be an elderly, if you happen to be a child, or if you happen to be a person with disability, you would be more likely to be impacted more than somebody who is able-bodied, or maybe somebody who is a man compared to, for example, say a woman. So we have to really recognize that because of this differentiated impacts of climate change, we need also to have differentiated interventions to cater to the needs of those specific groups.
Yeah, thank you, Victor and Albert, for your reflections and answers from the questions posed by our offline and online participants. And participation is one of the key points in the national adaptation, but also in the work of the cities, where local governments have to ensure that the inhabitants of their cities or their localities are participating in the urban planning processes. And that is also one of the highlights of RWI's work in the cities through the handbook that I believe you will have it at your hand. And we will have a very short break now. We have 5 minutes break for you to grab a coffee or a tea outside. And for our online participants, please hang tight and we will be back with you in 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
For human rights to be achieved, all parties must be engaged, aware, and understand the links between a healthy environment and human rights fulfillment. Without a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, enjoying other rights such as life, food, health, water, and development becomes a challenge. Knowledge and awareness on the link between the environment and human rights remains low, with limited processes and tools to share any knowledge that is available. To overcome this, all parties, government, private, and the community must be involved in awareness raising and knowledge sharing activities. Innovative research, as well as communicating and implementing research findings, is also a priority. Finally, tools and trainings must be developed and used to ensure there is awareness of the link between human rights and the environment across all parts of society. An increased understanding of this intrinsic link can result in a better natural environment and stronger human rights for those who live within it. Gender equality and the human rights-based approach in disaster risk reduction is central to address and reduce the impacts of climate change. Yet current frameworks provide limited guidance on how these aspects should be utilized in practice. The framework for integrating human rights and gender equality, or FIRE, bridges this gap, compiling international standards and guidelines for disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and emergency preparedness under 6 primary dimensions. developing and improving governance systems and structures, including disaster risk reduction laws and policies, inclusive institutions, and diverse platforms for civil society engagement. Ensuring fundamental rights and equality are reflected within international standards and processes as a foundation for the overall advancement of equality and inclusiveness. Addressing discrimination and inequality based on identity and socioeconomic characteristics, which widely intersect and affect the enjoyment of rights. Promoting participation of all people in decision-making that affects them, alongside inclusive access to information. Empowering rights holders, particularly disadvantaged and marginalized groups, to exercise their rights and to influence decisions that shape such rights. Examining, understanding, and then transforming social and gender norms that cause inequalities and contribute to contexts of vulnerability. FIRE is now being utilized to promote and protect human rights, with particular focus to gender and inclusivity within the implementation of disaster risk reduction mechanisms at global, regional, and local levels. For human rights to be achieved, all parties must be engaged, aware, and understand the links between a healthy environment and human rights fulfillment. Without a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, enjoying other rights such as life, food, health, water, and development becomes a challenge. Knowledge and awareness on the link between the environment and human rights remains low, with limited processes and tools to share any knowledge that is available. To overcome this, all parties, government, private, and the community, must be involved in awareness raising and knowledge sharing activities. Innovative research, as well as communicating and implementing research findings, is also a priority. Finally, tools and trainings must be developed and used to ensure there is awareness of the link between human rights and the environment across all parts of society. An increased understanding of this intrinsic link can result in a better natural environment and stronger human rights for those who live within it.
Good morning. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the second session of our conference. So those here with us, please do take a seat because we are about to start our panel discussions with 5 very esteemed panelists who here with us today, but also beaming in online from different parts of the world. And if I could introduce our panelists today, we have, hang on. Okay, we have Pak Arif Wibowo, who is beaming in from Bonn, Germany. Good morning, Pak Arif. So Pak Arif is a...
Morning,
Yes,
Lidi.
Pak Arif.
Thank you for the
Yes,
invitation.
thank you for taking the time. Very early in the morning for you, but let me introduce you and the other panelists before we start. So Pak Arif Wibowo is a policy analyst at the Ministry of Environment and Forestry of the Republic of Indonesia. As a policy analyst, Pak Arif has been conducting policy assessments and providing policy brief on climate change and development. And prior to that, he was the Deputy Director for Climate Change Adaptation at the same ministry. And Pak Arif got his degrees in engineering from the University of Diponegoro in Indonesia and University of Leeds in the UK. Next one, we have Dr. Wong Sok as Assistant Director and Head of Environment Division as a Secretariat, who is here with us today. Dr. Wong Sok is a passionate and dedicated environmental professional with over 20 years of global environmental compliance and governance experience, including in-depth knowledge of strategic environmental planning, environmental diplomacy, and operation control of environmental management systems. In education, he holds a bachelor degree in forestry from Cambodia and a master's degree in environmental science and management from Belgium. He further completed a PhD in impact assessment and climate change at the University of Western Australia in 2012. And he works extensively on environmental management in Southeast Asia in collaboration with government agencies, international organizations, development partners, CSOs, and communities, which has provided him with specific resources to direct and coordinate the strategic level and make significant impacts and contribution to this region. And we also have Dr. Saud Sagala, who is an assistant professor at School of Architecture, Planning and Policy Development Institute of Technology Bandung, or ITB, from Indonesia. Saud has conducted extensive research and consultancy experiences on spatial planning, disasters risk management, and climate change adaptation. And lastly, we have Mr. Herman Palani, who is an economic specialist and at the Office of Senior Advisor and to the Minister of Social Affairs and Poverty Reduction Ministry of National Development Planning. And we also have, again, Albert Salamanca as part of our panel discussion. So if I could call Dr. Wong Sok up to the front with me here. Yeah, you can sit here, please. Okay, so it's an honor to have all of you panelists and experts here with us today. And to start the discussion, we have two questions that we will ask each and every one of you, and you could give your reflection or responses to these questions which we have shared previously. But I would like to also share with the participants that I would like to ask, can you give us your unique insights into the findings and recommendations presented today? And moving forward, what are the main action points you would recommend to strengthen human rights and gender equality in national adaptation plans? Each of our panelists will have 10 minutes to respond. And after that, we will have a short Q&A session and another Slido survey. So if we can start with Pak Arif from the Ministry of Environment, please. Hello, Pak Arif.
Hello, good morning once again. All panelists, presenter, participants, I apologize, cannot join in the venue. Thank you. It's very short time, I know that, but thank you very much for this invitation again. Yes, this NAPS issue is we are in the struggle process because, as mentioned before, that among 190 countries, only less than 50 is implementing NAPS. Yeah. So this is our challenge, not only in the region but in the world. So the question is, how can we incorporating this human rights into the NAPS process and implementation? So NAPS is NAPS process and implementation, not only formulation, the planning, but also the implementation itself. As I saw the slides from Albert, that there are standard guidelines. How can we, these international standards or guidelines, put into the national level and local level? So yes, there are challenges, but we have in Indonesia already, for the case of Indonesia, already modalities. As mentioned also by Albert, that we have RAN API, but RAN API is not NAPS itself, as perceived for UNFCCC guidelines. So that is our challenge, but we have already considered this as our priority since we established that RAN API. But again, RAN API is a starting point that should be improved until we can follow these international standards. You know that Indonesia, as one of the countries already committed to the Paris Agreement, both adaptation as well as loss and damage. But we are many challenges on that, indeed. And how can we approach that? Recently, we have established a presidential decree to strengthen our national commitment. How can we put into the national process development, both mitigation and adaptation? So, and based on that, and then we have established NDC roadmap on adaptation. We are discussing about CCA and DRR as well. So we have already prepared some modalities. For example, we have already a national guideline for planning climate change adaptation at national level, and then how can we translate into subnational level. And we already have a guideline standards also in terms of methodology. Sorry, we have colleagues here. We have already technical guidelines how to assess vulnerability, risk, as well as impact of climate change. So, and one modality is in Indonesia now, we have already national vulnerability risk information system that already available for public. So this is our some modalities at national level, but there are tens of pilot projects which already including certain basic needs, as we discuss here, concerning how to consider the human rights into the NAPS process. But it's not explicitly we said that this is a human right, you know, but implicitly there are potential challenge for us how to identify the indicator of human right into national level and then translate it into the local level. So based on that, we can easily, hopefully, how can we mainstream this human right into the development process and the planning process, as well as implementations and then monitoring also. How can we do that? So I think that's my general comment for that. And lastly, I would like to confirm that Indonesia not yet established NAPS as guidelines by UNFCCC. Yeah, we are in the process of that, and we already receive readiness budget for the NAPS process, and we hope this can be as a starting point for Indonesia, especially to invite our stakeholders to be the part of this process. Windy, I think we can see what going on this discussion, and I'm ready for sharing any more question probably after that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Arif. And we noted some good developments in Indonesia in terms of climate change adaptation. And we now swiftly move to Mr. Herman Palani. Are you here with us?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, please, Mas Herman, you have 10 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Well, first of all, I would like to really appreciate of this forum because it is a really important and interesting forum for me. And first of all, really, it is apologize for the staff of the senior advisors to Minister of Social Affairs and Property because she cannot attend on this forum due to there is the other forum on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I try to represent her as a panelist for today. Well, actually, I have several points here to be delivered. The first is really agree of what has Albert said before, the climate change equals to human rights, right? Because that's why we are going to focus on the development policy that towards on the sustainable development. And you know that you mentioned that few countries that has mentions about the human rights in their national agenda, but I can make sure that Indonesia has got was the commitment on the human right prior to UNDHR, right? Because we have a national constitution, our national constitution that mention our human right in the chapter 2028. And the other thing is talking about the human rights. So we are talking about the national strategic plan, as we know that Indonesia has established Ranham in Indonesian language, the national strategic plan on the human right. So we are coming out to the fifth generations of our national strategic plan on human rights. So in 2021, we are focusing on the four aspect. There is women, disability, children's, and culture community, because we see that in our national planning that those groups are vulnerable, and also there are a lack of discriminations and lack of access. What I mean about the lack of access is there is a lack of access on infrastructure, technology, and also jobs. So that is our challenge in our the Ministry of National Development Planning. How do we have to achieve on these goals? Okay. Focusing on the very focused what's the population, there is I call disability, people with disability. So we are having a national the master plan on people with disability. So it is really crucial for Indonesia because 10% of people in Indonesia is disabled. We can see that 22 million people living under the disability condition. So that's why this could be our concern in the Bapanas, also of people with disability. And talking about the people with disability as a human right concern says, we have 7 goals of in our national plan of the people with disability. So one of the main goals is about the data. Now, when we are talking about the data, it is really crucial for Indonesia, maybe for other countries also, because not all country has their own the appropriate data to data about their people with disability. So that's why this is our main concerns in Indonesia about how do we have a disaggregated data, and how do we can implement a policy between through the evidence-based policy. So you know that in the pandemic crisis, so that's why we have pandemic hits us actually, right? Because we have a lower prosperity. So that's why in our 2023 we have a national strategic planning as an adaptation of the national adaptation plan. We have a term of inclusive and sustainable economic transformations, because we see that we now have to have the development that is more inclusive and also more sustainable. Toward on these goals, we have 6 instruments that is strengthen our human resource and also improve our economic sector productivity. And the third is green economy. So that's what what we discussed today, right? About the green one, because a green economy is really important for Indonesia, maybe for all the global countries, because when we are talking, because people live in the environment, right? So when we have a bad environment, so we have a bad human also. And the fourth is our digital transformations. And the sixth is the domestic economic integrations. And last is, as you know, that we have an agenda to move our new national nations and new capital city. Well, talking about this plan, I think there are two instruments that is really crucial. That first is evidence-based. How do we design our national development planning as well as adaptations is about evidence-based. So we try in every of our policy, we have a backgrounded study to design our policy. And the second is we also, as much as possible, to involve our community starting from the very lowest level. So that's why in our annual strategic plan, we have Musrembang Desa, right? Musrembang Desa is the very lowest level that we can gather information, the voice from the village and the community to know how they concerns about the development for 1 year ahead. So I think that is what I see from the government mindsets about this. And the last is we are going to enter our new RPJP, meaning the long-term national strategic plan that we will starting from the 2022 to 2014. That is 2020 to 2025. To 2045. So that is really also crucial in our government to know how do we adapt our development policy and how do we make sure our community can be more inclusive and toward our human rights. So I think that's what I say about what we do in our Ministry of National Development and about the whole of the agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mas Herman. And indeed, the inclusion or the participation of persons with disabilities, among other vulnerable.
I think the video stops, right?
I think
we have a lost connections of in the offline participant.
maybe we can just talk among ourselves.
Yeah, the connection seems lost. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, anyway, nice to meet everyone.
Yes, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet who are in online. Yeah.
I hope we see in person. I'm still stuck in Bangkok.
Yeah.
Oh.
Nice study, Albert. Nice, also nice.
Thank
nice
you.
work. Thank you.
So, where are you based now?
I'm based in Bandung, Albert.
Okay.
But of course, traveling around also in the past. But hopefully, soon. This going to be in the region as well.
Yeah, that's true.
It's not easy to arrange a hybrid, I really
yeah. Even if you really gone through the infrastructure, still you will encounter problems.
Yeah, that's true.
Pak Herman, are you based in Jakarta?
Yes, I'm in Jakarta right now.
Okay. You have a nice background, so I thought you're in the US.
Oh, this is a default background right in this zone.
Arif, are you following the intersessionals in Bonn now?
Yes, we just finished yesterday. I'm doing on the loss and damage also, as well as adaptation.
So any new things on the loss and damage front?
Yeah, it's a long way, but there are steps wise that we try to strengthen our position. That we need capacity, we need, as mentioned before by you also, that adaptation And then in line with this selesai damage, how can we also to understand this the scientific issues, and then how can we put into the policy, into the our national, and regional as well, regional, national, and subnational what's that level in terms of indicator, in terms of existing modality that we can
One of the
strengthen. Sorry.
of the flood in the region, it accumulate and impact. And those issues really impact to the main primary sector. I mean, it's the agriculture and the farmer, and those we are very vulnerable. And that's the way also confirm the some movement of people, the migration and mobility choice of the people. This is not because of the way they prefer, because of the pressure, the threat, threat to non-security, non-traditional security of the climate change. So with that respect, people really make things for their own thing, and that informs something for your consideration. This inform our action, our policy, whether from policy or practice, may not have addressed enough. That is one of the key message informer. Second thing, the thing we address may not be good enough to address the vulnerable group, may not be the right entry point for the vulnerable or target population. So that's the way you come up with this sort of assessment. I mean, one of the things I appreciate, the assessment sort of framework that can be used, can be replicated many other things in order plan or policy development, because this to guide the way how to integrate in the planning and management sort of process. Now, I say to the finding itself, it's really reflect the reality, like I highlight from disaster happen. And that's not really stop there, it's continues to grow. So with that situation, your finding, it's very relevant and very useful. So with that relevant and useful, what is that relevant and useful? It's not only the assessment of framework itself, but the finding you said about the social sort of inclusion, the vulnerable population, the women empowerment, the vulnerable group sort of empowerment is quite important, need to include them in the process. And social sort of integration is maybe one of the things that also one of the priority of ASEAN, but we may not be fully capture the thing that from the climate human rights dimension. So, and then you point out about economic aspect as well, it provide them incentive, like part of the UN CCC conventions about loss and damage, how we can ensure that. So all these things need to be reflect as well. So all in all, I think it's about you point rightly from also including the legal aspect that people have the right choice, the rights for them to involve and to make their own future. So with that, I reaffirm ASEAN Secretariat really recognize the value of human rights and also the climate change aspect. That's why a number sort of policy paper and commitment of ASEAN really try to integrate this part of inclusive process. Even in the ASEAN social cultural blueprint, we highlight about key priority on inclusive aspect, resilient, and specifically the recovery, ASEAN recovery framework. They already highlight more the way we need to focus the target population, where we need to give them a chance after this sort of pandemic and after or post-pandemic issue. So I think from ASEAN it's really recognized that. Now look at the way you provide recommendation as a way forward. I can see a lot of things to look at that, and also but to me, it's two things about policy and practice. The recommendation itself fit into the policy, but it's when it comes to practice, it need to do more. So with that, it comes to the question when I have a quick chat with Jason is about how. I mean, the question how here is about three things that I can see how. How it means that come to the people who give you access to the opportunity. I mean, the government and also the opportunity that or the platform that they provide you. So unless they know you can give some contribution and you provide important input to the planning decision-making process, of course they will engage you. So I think the government, you need to somehow let them know, have the opportunity for you and also the right information for them as well. So so far, awareness raising to the politician level is still important to make the message get across. And also this may also inform. The second thing, it's about the receiver, which is the community. You need to know about yourself as well as about where the right opportunity, where the right platform, when the right time to access, and which way. And all of this is not only understand about your rights, but understand about the opportunity, how you can engage, how you can contribute. So when you know this opportunity, you streamline your process. I believe this is the way you can get through. Without having this sort of both side commitment, public sector, also the vulnerable population, it may not be translated to action. So I think it's a both side quite important. Third point that I would like to highlight is about the about the opportunity that the community can make a difference. And not necessarily depend on the public sector. That the way what we call a number of things happen around with the CBO thing, the community-based organization. You together can make a difference. And with that, I may say, one connect to the CBO, we strongly believe in ASEAN, the youth can make a transformation change. To work with the grassroots, to understand the real issue, and you are the transformative change to make the society more inclusive and resilient and greener ASEAN. Thank you very much. I end my point here.
Round of applause to Dr. Wong Sok, please. Thank you, Dr. Wong Sok, for highlighting some of the regional commitments to also include the people in different policy levels, and for highlighting the importance of youth in this context. And we have a strong representation from ASEAN Youth Forum here with us today. Very happy to see you all. And we now move on to our next panelist, which is Dr. Saud Sagala, who is beaming in from Bandung, Indonesia.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good morning. Thank you, moderator. And let me also greet colleagues and also distinguished speakers and also expert there. Good morning, Dr. Pong. Good morning, Pak Arif, Jason, Albert, and Victor, and others who I cannot say one by one. It's really good opportunity. Unfortunately, I cannot come because of other meetings as well. Let me congratulate also RWI and also SEI with this important study, because I think human right is really an important issue to be addressed, and also something that part of the increasing how climate change would affect, and also addressing the needs of the all representative from the majority, minorities, and also people affected by climate change. I would like to start my comment first is through the document itself, which the study itself, which I think it's very important that human rights principles are something important to be considered, but do not really feature much in the reviewed national adaptation plans. And I think in the process, it's also mentioned about how Fiji National Adaptation Plan is considered to have systematically referenced human rights, which I think could be used or should be used as one of the examples, and how the human rights would be promoted and also considered in other national adaptation plan. There are some references mentioned about how NAPs in Suriname, in Saint Vincent, and also Timor-Leste and Sudan. However, of course, there are some human rights terms that do not mention in the reviewed NAPs, and I think this is an important area to be highlighted further, which I think correlate with Dr. Pong closing. I think on the including people, those of the vulnerable groups and communities to be considered in the climate change impact. In terms of the call for rights-based approach to national adaptation planning, I think the first concern is how a right-based approach, and to understand broadly that it will be providing meaningful inclusion of vulnerable groups and communities in the NAP process. And this is to ensure that the outcomes of NAPs are socially equitable, to be inclusive, and to respond to their concerns and priorities. Second concern would be human rights framing of the NAP process can also facilitate the fulfillment of state obligations. So we discussed about the role of government, very important. So to human rights treaties and also what have been ratified. And of course, this will include from the planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So earlier, previous speaker mentioned about how to connect with policy into practice. I would also highlight in echo to that to add with monitoring and evaluation, because then with implementation, we need to include how the implementation is being monitored and also taking into considerations of the human right-based approach. Reflection on the report, I think various countries have shown examples and might not subscribe to all the points of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, this could also play a role in human rights not being referenced systematically per the standard. But page of the 15 of the report, for example, noted that most of the NAP design process implemented participatory approaches. However, we could also scrutinize or ask what kind of process within this participatory approach, problems of in terms of how to integrate human rights, which might not take into consideration of the whole aspect of the human rights. And then the report also noted different translations of human rights in the NAPs reviewed on freedom, equality, and life is translated differently. And then the potential priority problem between ensuring human rights and adaptations. And there is a potential conflicts between Article 17 and displacement due to climate hazard, and particularly with our works in Bandung and also in West Java with Resilience Development Initiative, we studied actually how displacement due to disasters and disasters related to climate change, that it's important to consider how the access to basic infrastructures, and also how those who are being displaced also have their rights being fulfilled. Now, I have some recommendations that I think important also to be considered, and also possible challenges, that the further exploration research on the root causes that may affect how human rights being, let's say, not considered much or should be understood well. I think it would be important to think about the root causes as well. Climate change is one thing, but on the other hand, what causes the vulnerability would be very important. And this is where I would believe that NGOs or think tank like WRI or even RDI and others would need to provide evidence base, to provide analysis, and then to connect what could be improved and also strengthened through policy and also implementation. And then there is, of course, potential conflicts between adaptation efforts and human rights, and that can be resolved by focusing on inclusive community-driven solutions. I think Dr. Fong mentioned about flooding earlier, and let me take this example as well. If you try to mitigate flooding in the term of disaster, we use mitigation for disaster, for example, but we also can ask questions whether that kind of let's say flood measures would affect would these measures affect the communities in the same way, or it can be different as well, and you might protect one community, but on the other hand also causing problems to other communities. So this kind of understanding about the systemic risk and also the root causes would be very important, and also about the impact for each works. The recent GPDRR, the Global Platform Disaster Risk Reduction, that happened about 3 weeks ago, from the summary and also our own experience with disaster displacement, highlight that very important on community-driven solutions and inclusivity. And the recommendation is to amplify the successful inclusive community-driven solutions to increase resilience and solve disaster displacement. And we think it's important also to ensure comprehensive definitions of vulnerable or marginalized groups in the reviewed countries. And as we agree that problems in translating human rights systematically into national adaptation plan might stem from lower capacity of our understanding and also how planners and policymakers deal with the issue of human rights. So it is important to have the dialogues and also share, I would say, maybe guidelines and capacity building on this matter. And finally, it's important also in the high quality pre-disaster planning and post-disaster need assessment that ensure human rights, equality, and inclusivity should be established. And this is also echoed and also put in the summary of GPDRR co-chairs. I think let me end here, and thank you again, and congratulations WRI and also Stockholm Environmental Institute. Over to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Saud Tagala, for your insightful comments and some recommendations that I've jotted down here, actually. And since we're running a little bit behind, I'm just going to call out our last speaker who we met before. So, Albert, if you could give your short remarks, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just sort of reflecting on the points raised by our esteemed speakers earlier. There are 4 points that I'd like to offer. One is that there's really a need to accelerate the implementation of NAPs so that we achieve coherence in our interventions. And as Pa Ari mentioned, of course, he identified the difference between the NAP, the earlier NAP, and the NAP process, because the earlier NAP tend to be very much focused on documents produced for certain kinds of activities. But this one, really, the NAPS process is to ensure coherence of government interventions. Second is that we need to ensure that NAPs respond to the needs of the vulnerable and at-risk communities. That's fundamental. The third is that is the point that Pa Saud mentioned. We also need to track the implementation of the NAPs to learn from how they were being implemented so that we can reformulate again the next cycle of implementation. And finally, the fourth point that I'd like to raise is that the fundamental point why we need human rights principles to be incorporated in the NAP process is that to achieve just adaptations. In other words, it's not just adaptation of the majority, but it's also adaptation of all other vulnerable groups. And also to ensure that an adaptation of one particular group will not lead to the maladaptation of another group. So for example, a good example on this one is that using dikes or coastal embankments to prevent coastal erosion. So that might be good in terms of preventing coastal inundation, flooding, but it might be bad for fishermen who wanted to land their boats or to land their fish catch. So we really have to ensure that our actions on adaptation will not lead to maladaptation of other groups. So that's why human rights principles, I think, is really fundamental to our plans and actions on with regards to the NAP. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Albert. And we are now can open for question and answers from our both online and offline participants. Do we have a question? I could take yes, one Mas Unang, and maybe one more from our in-person participants. Okay, we can take Mas Unang, please.
Yes, thank you, Mbak Windy. Yeah, especially to Pak Arif and to Albert actually. Pak Arif highlighted the importance of implementation of NAP, and in the context of Indonesia, we see that the Indonesian National Action Plan RAN-API also stated the importance of collaborative effort and participation from various stakeholders and cooperation between national governments, subnational governments, private sector, development partners, and communities. However, addressing the needs of vulnerable groups and communities in the NAPs, as mentioned as well in from the in the discussion in the morning, that both the process and the outcomes continues to be a challenge. So my question to Pak Arif, how do you think that the right-based approach, especially to enable meaningful inclusion of vulnerable groups and communities, can be adopted on the adaptation targets and action plan in Indonesia? And to Albert, is there any good practice from a particular country on the adoption of right-based approach on targets and action plan of national adaptations? Thank you.
Parif or Albert, who wants to go first?
Parif, if I can go first on the second point.
Please. Yes,
yeah.
Please.
Yeah, so the question was, are there best practices from other countries? I think there is, and that would be the NAP of Fiji. So if you look at the NAP of Fiji, they actually identified each of the specific groups that need adaptation, and then they develop actions for them. So, and then right at the get-go, right at the beginning of the design of the NAP, the app actually said that they're going to adapt a human rights-based approach. So a lot of the planning that came out of that is based on the process, based on that understanding of human rights-based approach. So it's really good to look at the NAP, the Fiji NAP. So in fact, if you look at, I'm looking at it now. So like, for example, they have systemic priorities. So they really look at what are the priorities of different sectors, and then and develop actions. And then who are the vulnerable groups within each of the sectors that need to adapt. So again, the Fiji NAP could be a good example in that sense. Thanks a lot for the question. Parif?
Yes. Right. I have few slides, if I may share. This make us easy how we are already on the way, how we can try to incorporate these human rights issues. Can I share my slide? Let me. Okay. Sorry, Pak Unang and college. We are in the. We should have the same framework by using this slide. most of you may be aware with this slide, but let's see that how we are trying to put this framework into our. Can you see this? My slide? We are
Yes,
in the
Pak Arief.
process. Yes, thank you. We would like to adopt this framework, and we already on that way. So how can human rights can put into this framework? What indicator we would like to agree at national level and subnational level, for example? Because when we, if I may propose, how can we identify the vulnerable groups into these vulnerability indicators, and then we can see how these groups will be exposed to the climate change, how far, how high, they are at the position of very high risk or low risk, and what action can we intervene. And then Indonesia already have this kind of national vulnerability and risk assessment information that can be accessed by everybody. If I give one example, when we put one click here, we can see one village. It's already at the village level in Indonesia. We have more than 80,000 villages anyway. So we can see the main indicator that we already published. There are 21 national indicator which can be improved when we coming with the human right indicator. We can put in place into the system. This is very short way. So when you have already a kind of national indicators in terms of human rights, how can we incorporating these vulnerable groups, children's, genders, and elderly, and so on and so on. So we can put it into this system, in the CIDIC system. We call it CIDIC system, but I'm not CIDIC. And then we can put, sorry, this is in Indonesia, but basically our system can be strengthened by putting this human right indicator. This is one example. In one local government in I don't see the name. One district there. So beyond the 21 indicator, they can put their need, local need. So they have adaptive capacity indicator from 13 to 19. Sorry, okay. They have already added their local indicator and other information, exposure, and sensitivity. So they can put easily, and we are working on that. So how can we accelerate, as mentioned by Albert, that we need to accelerate at national as well as local level, but we have the system already. And again, we have a commitment for that. Let's work together. We are very welcome to share, to join for the process of this, to facilitate anyway, as a government, to facilitate how to incorporating this human rights principles, indicators into in place in the NAPS process, and then as well as development process. Thank you, Windy. It's my necessary. Thank you for this very my discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Arief, and thank you, Albert, also Mas Unang, for the question. I am afraid that we are running out of time because the call of praying has started. But if you do have questions or comments, please do reach out to us. We are all here, or RWI staff are here. So just email us if you have questions or comments, or you want to discuss more about national adaptation or other RWI work in the region on human rights and environment. And thank you so much for all the panelists who are here with us and also online. It was very much a pleasure to have you all here. And to close the session, I would like to call Victor. Victor? Thank you so much, Pak Fong Sok.
Okay, I'll be very quick, but thank you all. On the behalf of RWI, I would like to thank both our offline and our online participants for taking the time to join us, and all of you, your active and insightful participation today, which will inform the next phase of this research. I hope to see you again in future events, including the launches of our future reports and manuals and briefs on human rights and climate change adaptation. Also, if you're attending COP27, please do reach out because we have a lot of different activities that we want to put forward. So, and Brisbane as well, the APMCDRR in September. We have had a very, well, for me at least, it's been very informative discussion on, for example, how to incorporate human rights at an indicator level, at the regional level, national and local levels. And Indonesia has a lot of good practices that we will take with us and hopefully share with our other countries here in ASEAN, especially for our twin launch in Bangkok that will be held on the 28th. Unfortunately, it is a fully offline event. I hope you at least found these discussions fruitful and thought-provoking, and I hope the report will be a good read for you.